Welcome to Submain-hosted webcast Coding Standards in the Real World. My name is Serge Baranovsky. I'm principal of Submain, and I will be moderating today's webcast. We had a great response to our webcast invitation and have set up additional webcast URL for the overflow. Today we're streaming using both GoToMeeting and Meeting Burner at the same time. Before we get started, I wanted to quickly review a few housekeeping items. First, you have the option to connect via voice over IP or by phone. All attendee lines are automatically muted to ensure that everybody watching get the best audio quality possible. Next, everyone is welcome to ask questions using the questions window, which is located in the bottom part of the GoToWebinar panel or on the right of your screen. Those of you on Meeting Burner, use the Ask a Question button in the top left part of your screen. We'll address as many questions as possible at the end of the webcast, and if we don't get your question answered, we'll follow up with you after the event. Finally, we are recording today, and we will send out a link to the recording and the ebook to everyone within a few days. Our guest presenter today, David McCarter, Microsoft MVP. David has been presenting on coding standards for over 9 years now at various conferences and events. So with that, I will hand this over to David.
Welcome, everyone. Here's just a little slide about me. Again, like Serge said, I'm a Microsoft MVP. I'm actually touring all over the country right now speaking about coding events and other topics. You can go and find out about those speaking events at the URL right there. Parts of this talk and other things I talk about in my conference sessions is based off my book, David McCarter's .NET Coding Standards. I'm also the author, publisher of .NETtips.com, which has actually been around one way or the other since 1994. I'll also have some open source projects up on Codeplex.com. I'm also the president founder of the San Diego .NET Developers Group, which we actually turn 20 years old next week. I've also been teaching at the University of California for 17 years now. That's enough about me. So today we're going to talk about the benefits of coding standards, which is something that is very important to me, especially now that I'm a contractor, and not only do I want to submit good code, but I see a lot of code that needs a lot of work. So we're going to talk about some of that today. So the first thing we're going to do is do a poll to see how many people here have tried to implement guidelines at your team or organization. And we'll just give it a few minutes to give everybody's input, or a few seconds.
All right, so we have everybody, we closed the poll. Now you can see the results on the screen. For some reason, David cannot see the results. I believe all attendees can see the results. As we expected, some of you tried and succeeded, but more than half either tried and failed or haven't even tried. That is pretty much consistent with our experience.
So why are standards needed? Hopefully some of you who have tried to implement coding standards know this, and the others will learn about that today. The biggest thing is, there's lots of great things. Code, easier to understand someone else's code. It's always been difficult in a lot of cases to take over somebody else's code. Easier to maintain is very important because that way we can go in and not only fix bugs, but reduce bugs, fix bugs, but also add new features. Code reviews, if you're doing code reviews, this is a really big point. So, we're going to talk more about that too. Shorter learning curve for team members is very important too if you're hiring new people, especially juniors. It's very important to have code that's very, very easy for them to understand and get on board running. You don't take weeks or months trying to get your team members up on board. If you have large teams and distributed teams, this is also very important, especially if you're sharing DLL's code in between teams at your company, which could be large. And then, of course, regulatory initiatives is very important. I've known many companies here in San Diego, California, where I live, that to do 911 software, that this is very important to them too. The business benefits, of course, is to improve software quality. That just means less tech support calls. Tech support calls in the end can be very expensive for the business. Accelerate time to market. You have competitors. You want to get to the market quicker, especially nowadays. You know, we have very short release cycles. This is important for that. Enhance customer satisfaction is also, you don't want calls. You want customers to be happy with your software, hopefully. Reduce long-term costs and improve productivity. Just the business wants to get things out quick, add features quick, and if you do coding standards, this will help you do that. I'm not going to ask if you've worked with someone else's code, because I'm going to assume pretty much everybody here has. And most people that I've polled over 9 years of speaking about the subject never like to take over somebody else's code. And the first thing they like to do is they like to rewrite it. And that's something we want to get away from. So with coding standards, some of the big things that people don't do is not enough documentation. Magic numbers is a big one. We'll talk, I have a sample code coming up here in a little bit about that. Meaning just taking numbers and turning them into enumerations is the best way to go. Very, very large classes. I recently saw one the other day that was 2,000 or 3,000 lines of code. That's much, much too large for a class. Just bad naming and formatting. Tightly coupled code these days. When we write, we want to get code that's not very coupled at all. That way we can add features quickly. Global variables are also an issue. Broken code. Lots of people, when they find some broken code, they either copy and paste and leave the broken code there. We don't need that. And improper scoping. Scoping is something I see a lot that people just don't think about enough, which could cause issues in the end, especially with mobile and websites. So this is something I found recently about cost of fixing bugs. And you can see here in the third bar, just when you get to coding, it's already costing 10 times the cost if you would have figured out the issues back in the requirements phase. And then, of course, it goes up to over 150 times the cost if you get into the production stage and having customers calling into tech support. It becomes very, very, very expensive to fix bugs, and we don't want to do that. We want to save money for the company, hopefully, and get the product out a lot faster. And this is what coding standards does. From some of the research that Submain has done, what's the number one reason they fail is developers keep forgetting to abide by the guidelines. This is something else we're going to talk about today. Number 2 there you can see is consensus on a standard. That makes sense to me, but the number 1 is people just not doing it. One time at my last company, I walked around and asked everybody if they were doing coding standards, and they had my book buried down in a drawer, and that's definitely not the right way to do that. Here's some examples of good and bad coding practices. So the first thing I want to review very, very quickly is some of the top 10 coding issues that CodeIt.Right has found. And I'm just going to go over a few of these really quick. And these are the same guidelines as Microsoft follows. Do not declare externally visible instance fields. This is a big one to me because if you do this, you're basically breaking encapsulation and you're breaking the first pillar of object-oriented programming. I also see people still not checking for empty strings correctly. You should never be using the equals. You should always be using is null or empty, or is null white space for that. Do not initialize unnecessarily. This is a performance issue. For example, all value types have a default value. So many times I see people setting booleans to false or integers to 0, and you're basically just initializing it twice, and it can be a performance issue if you do that thousands of times, of course. Error handling is one of the big ones I see not being done correctly. We'll talk a little bit more about that in some sample code coming up. So we're going to go on to the next slide. And while the next slide is coming up, I want to say very quickly is all the code examples in this section is real code that I found. None of this is made up, unfortunately. Hopefully you are already picking up on some of the issues here. For instance, facilities ID probably shouldn't be a string. Actually, this type has 168 public string fields in reality, and this is definitely not the right way to design a type. So let's look at how some of these things could have been fixed. So the first thing I did when I went in to fix this type is I turned transaction type into an enumeration, like none, order, payment, refund. Again, this is easy not only to understand in code, but very easy to detect problems even while you're building the code. The next thing I did was they were setting order data as a string that came into the type of constructor. That should have been done somewhere else. And I modified the transaction type property to use the transaction type enumeration, which of course is the right way to do that. And any new properties I was setting to the proper type. So open dawn was a date time, et cetera, et cetera. And I've got a couple more slides to show this, some more issues I did. The is closed Boolean I've set to a private set because it should be done somewhere else, and you're going to see that on the next slide. I also changed closed on to a nullable type because closed on only happens when this type is actually closed, so it can have a null default type. In the property, you should be setting the values if it's already the same. You should always be validating the values coming into any method or property in your type. This is part of encapsulation. You should throw appropriate exceptions if the value is not correct. And then finally, in this example, if everything happened the way we wanted it, then we're setting closed. It's not the responsibility of some code somewhere else in some application to set closed. It's actually the responsibility of the type. Here's another example that I've seen, and there's a lot of things going on in here that I want to address, and very quickly. The first thing is it's setting back a result type, but the biggest thing here is it's setting a message to be caught in the catch below. It's been a long time since I've seen some code like this. So that's definitely not the right way to do that. Also, DLLs should not be logging, and DLLs should also not be sending emails. That's really the job of the application itself. So how do we fix this? Well, most of the code is gone. You can see here I deleted most of the code for this one, and if it's not the proper checking there and the not equals, then I show the appropriate invalid operation exception, and we go from there. And then in this case, I'm also using resources for globalization because somewhere down the line, there's a really, really good chance your application is going to be changed to another language than it was written in. Well, the messages and things like that will be. So dealing with and throwing exceptions, this is something I don't see done a lot. So only use try-catch in a DLL, which I call an API, when you can do something with the exception, like cleaning up database connection strings and file handles. You could do a retry. Also, DLLs should never be catching the exception base type, because that way, if you're doing this, you're just swallowing the exception, which you need to know about in the end. And when you're trying to find the problems in your application, well, in your DLLs, this will really help if you don't do that. And also throw meaningful exceptions back up to the caller of your code, not exception. Use either a type from the .NET framework or create your own type by inheriting exception. Here's something else I see a lot in code. So this developer, who actually was a senior developer, did a try finally block in their code, and they were setting, you can see here they were setting the SQL data reader, the connection, and another connection to close, and they thought they were doing this correctly. This is actually really not correct. What I'm going to show you is this will most likely cause memory issues in your .NET application. So this whole code is wrong, and I'm going to show you how to fix this. Actually really easy in the next slide, and also actually easier to read. One of the things you want to do with any type that implements iDisposable is you want to dispose of it as soon as you're done with it. This prevents what we call in .NET virtual memory leaks. And virtual memory leaks are basically not like memory leaks that you've seen in other applications, but it'll basically just eat up all the memory on your machine until it slows down or stops. And I've seen this happen. In this example that we saw before is the SQL data reader and the connections should be using the using pattern that we have in .NET now. And if you use the using pattern, then when you implement it in the using statement, that creates the type, and then down below you can see a calls dispose on the connections at the end of the code block. This just makes it a lot easier for you as a coder to remember that these are happening, and you're cleaning up your not only are you calling close, but you're also disposing of the object, releasing the memory back up to the memory handler, and you won't cause any virtual memory leaks if you do this. Some more suggestions that I have seen in my many, many years of coding is a lot of code will just blatantly call a database server, an internet site, or ping an internet site when there might not be a network connection. So you could write some code to get around that and make it easier. .NET really doesn't have global exception handling, but you can do some things in WinForms, ASP.NET, WPF to basically catch an exception that someone didn't handle correctly and either hopefully recover from it, tell the user the application needs to be restarted. Another new one I found actually recently was the app domain first chance exception. This actually fires when any exception with your entire domain is called, and you can log these. And I found very quickly that there was some code written by another company that was throwing like 300 exceptions in under a second. So this worked really well for me for that one. And also check out Aspect Programming. It makes a lot of this much, much easier. Let's talk really quick about the 7-step approach for successful implementation. So I'm going to review this quickly because we have slides for each one of these. The first one is business owner buy-in. It's very, very important so we as developers have time to actually do what I'm talking about and what we're going to be talking about later, getting consensus among the developers, having a standard, making it easier for the developers to have, implement coding reviews, also using some of the great code generation tools, not only in .NET, but from other companies. And then you need to constantly have status and give feedback. So the first one is maybe one of the hardest ones to do is get the business owner's buy-in. This is crucial for success of coding standards. You need to show the business owners, meaning the project managers, the managers, why coding standards and doing what we want to do correctly is going to benefit the business. And we're going to be talking more about how you actually show this to the business owners later in the last section of this session. You need to stress the benefits, less bugs, lower maintenance costs is what they're always looking for, and also implementing new features can become longer and longer and longer if you don't follow these practices. And they need to know the costs, including staff timing and things like that. And this is actually one of the hardest things to come up with, but we're going to talk how that can be easy at the last section, like I said before. So consensus, really, you need to get everybody on board with what's going to happen with your coding standards, not only management, but quality assurance and the developers themselves. There's many options out there to help you do what we're talking about in this session today. Once you come with a initial consensus, then you can begin at this point and change it as needed, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too. The next part is choosing a base standard to follow. One of the things here is not to get stuck in wars about where the curly braces should be and things like that. In Visual Studio, and there's other add-ins to Visual Studio, makes this really easy to do, actually do properly. There's a lot of great standards out there, besides mine, that will help you with this, and the Microsoft Design Guidelines, which I constantly look at, is a definitely a good way to start with. And many tools implement that, including CodeIt.Right, we'll talk about later. There's other ones out there from iDesign and Philips C# coding standards. So there's lots out there to be your base and start from there. I definitely wouldn't start from scratch. It's a very long process. You should customize the standard if you need to, including name spacing. The big ones to me per company could be, how you name your namespaces. Most people put their company name at the very beginning of their namespace. Assembly naming, same thing. How you use strong key assemblies. Actually, most, if not all, your assemblies should be strong key named, and also that should be definitely a customization into your coding standards. And the workflow and how you check in and check out code, especially the check-in part we'll talk about later. And if you deviate too much from from what's most people are doing nowadays, then it really makes it harder for developers to follow. But not only to follow, they're not going to want to do it if it's not what they've known in the past. It's okay to change it and fit it for your company and or team, but don't go too far off the tracks. The next thing is from the consensus and the changes, make your own guidelines document and make it very easy to have available to all the developers. And there really should be two big sections in how you look at your coding standards. One is required. Required should be things like calling dispose, things like that, that not only are hard at the application to make sure that virtual memory leaks don't happen, but also other things just about naming, things like that, so everything looks consistent. And also, I've said this already, is make company required standards that might exist. The next really important part of making sure that your coding standards happen, and this is something I don't see most people doing, is you need to enforce is kind of a hard word, but you need to make sure your coding standards are happening. And one of the best ways to do that is doing code reviews. Developers, including consultants, have a tendency to write code the way they want to, and especially write code they've done like they've done in the past. That doesn't really work in a team environment. So you need to make sure that's happening either by code review or pair programming is the two best ways to make sure this happens. Don't get into criticism. We're not there to make someone feel bad or make someone feel superior. So no criticism. Make it a safe place to have people not only see how the code is, make sure the code is written correctly, but this is also a really, really great place to learn and be a better developer, especially if you're junior or intermediate. This also needs to be complemented with automated review, and automated review should really be done during the build process, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about that. But it's definitely, in my book, you should definitely be doing both these things. Code review or pair programming, and with that, automated review. And then there's lots of tools that make this very, very easy to, well, a lot easier to do nowadays than it was in the past. I said earlier, there's a lot of code generation tools that spit out good code for you, and these generation tools can create access to databases, collections, enumerations, things like that. There's lots of tools out there. CodeSmith has been around the longest. I've been using that for a very long time. And now we have the .NET Entity Framework to do object relational mapping to databases. I use this pretty much solely nowadays. Also, there's T4 templates that you can learn how to use and do that. There's many, many more now, not only as third-party applications, but built into .NET. That makes this much easier. And usually the code generated is okay, and you basically don't even need to check it by your tools or pair programming. And then the last step, of course, is review how everything's been going and then give feedback and modify the process and or the documents as we go along. And also, it's very important to report back to the business owners how everything's going, otherwise they don't think anything's happening and there's really no point in doing this. In review, this is a never-ending cycle, getting the buy-in, consensus, standards, code reviews, code generation, review and feedback. This should be a normal part of your development cycle as you're developing your app and doing modifications and releasing new versions and things like that. So those are the 7 steps. We're going to go on to the next section and talk how to make this easier. Well, sorry, not the next section yet. So some of the things that are really easy to implement as coding standards are naming conventions, formatting, patterns, error handling, and usage guidelines. It takes a little more time to do security, performance, design. They're 2 of my big ones. Globalization takes a little more time, but to me it's a very necessary step in this world. Maintainability and other best practices. So on the left there you see a lot of things you can do. It's pretty easy. On the right, it's takes a little bit more time, but there's a bigger bang for your buck as you roll that out. Let's talk about how CodeIt.Right is going to help you in these steps. So what's CodeIt.Right? CodeIt.Right is an automated way to make sure your code follows out of the box the Microsoft design guidelines. And you can run CodeIt.Right per class, per application, per solution. And as you can see here on the right-hand side, it's going to show you the violations that are in your code, and then you go on and decide how you're going to fix those. It's a static code analysis tool, so it actually just runs on code. I've actually tested on code that I couldn't even build, and it works fine. And you can also implement automated refactoring as you're coding too, which is a really great step. CodeIt.Right helps you to do all these things and actually makes this process of making sure that coding standards are being followed in your code or on a team level very, very easy. It just saves tons of time. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about how that happens. First thing which is newer in CodeIt.Right is instant code review. So as you're typing, it'll actually start telling you that there's some things you need to take care of. In this example, they're showing you the implementing iSerializable for serializable classes, which is one of the things that, in the end, it's not really that much code, but there's a pattern to it, and CodeIt.Right will help you do that instantly. You can also set up CodeIt.Right to control your check-in policy. This is also very important, that if you have some guidelines that your code must follow before it's even checked in, you can add this to the check-in policy in Visual Studio, and basically you can't check in code until you fixed everything, which is something I like, especially when you have developers working for you. There's hundreds and hundreds of rule sets that comes with CodeIt.Right, which are, like I said, by default are the Microsoft guidelines. Security, performance, usage, design, maintainability are 2 of my big ones. Exception handling is also a big one, and async, which is pretty difficult to do nowadays, is also a big one that CodeIt.Right will help you with. The benefits are in, of course, improving the quality while you're coding. As we saw in the diagram before, as you're fixing things, it's costing a lot even at the coding stage. Decrease the time of code reviews. If you're doing code reviews, which I hope you're doing, if you use CodeIt.Right, then your code reviews will be much, much faster. Reduce QA testing, of course, is a big one. And you also always want to do quality solutions, and CodeIt.Right will help you with that. Here's how CodeIt.Right will help you do those things. The first one is we need to talk about the business owner's buy-in. And I've found in the past that if you're going to get them to buy in, you need to give them dollars. And so you can actually calculate on a Submain website the actual costs of doing these things as compared to, manually as compared to using it with CodeIt.Right. So on the right-hand side here, we can see if you're doing 2 reviews per week and the average length per review, the savings per week is going to be $420 and $20,000 per year. If you're doing auto corrections, which CodeIt.Right does, that makes like the eye serializable, fixing it right there will save you upwards to $100,000 per year. And this is what owners like to see. And definitely this is something you can give to them. And once you do, I found this works a lot better than just telling them that you need to do this. If you give them actual costs, this process will be much, much easier to implement in your team and company. The general consensus is easier when you have a tool to make sure not only these guidelines are happening. What I found is using a tool like CodeIt.Right is you actually start learning these and they start getting ingrained into you, and you're going to start doing less and less of these coding problems or mistakes. It helps you follow the base standard out of the box. Like I said before, CodeIt.Right follows the Microsoft coding guidelines, but there's lots of easy ways we're going to be talking about in a slide or two to change this. And there's lots of guidelines out there you can start with, including the one from Submain. The important part of any tool is to customize it. The great thing about CodeIt.Right is all the rule sets in CodeIt.Right can be customized towards your team. You can add your own standards into CodeIt.Right, share that among your team in the enterprise version. So you can do custom profiles. You can tweak existing rules, which is something that I do. There's some rules, even the Microsoft guidelines, that I think should be more important than they do. I can easily go in there and fix that and make them errors instead of warnings. And of course, you can create your own custom rule sets. It's very easy to customize these things. And then in the end, once you come up with one or multiple profiles you're going to be using in your team, it's easy to then see that with documentation out of the box. You can easily just read the documentation with Internet Explorer, and you can customize it from there. So you need to focus on what's really important to fix. I once was on a project where there was 20,000 violations, if you can believe it. There's really things that you need to focus on. And of course, the first ones are usually the errors. And you can see here in the diagram here in CodeIt.Right, it's very easy to change how you look at the severity levels and probably tackle the errors first before you get to the warnings. You can also exclude projects files for specific violations too. So the automated code review, the instant code review dramatically cuts the costs of doing coding standards. And we're back to a similar diagram as I showed you in the beginning. The cost of fixing problems in coding phase, design coding phase, as opposed to when it gets to the end user. CodeIt.Right fixes these issues right on the spot. It's safe and tested refactorings. And one of the things I do when I talk about CodeIt.Right in conferences is that there's also FX Copper Analyze in Visual Studio, but those two applications just tell you what's wrong. What CodeIt.Right does is you basically click on a button and it fixes it for you. And that's the big time savings that I really, really like about CodeIt.Right. So you can fix it in real time. You can make it a check-in policy, which I think should be mandatory. And the other thing is make it part of your build process. And don't release things until they meet the standards of your code. Another screen I look at a lot is the screen right here, which gives you the status and feedback, not only of types, but also on how things are progressing in your project. In the diagram here on the right-hand side, you can see it will show you by type or category where most of the issues are. And this is what I use, especially when I'm if I take over somebody else's code, is to look at this and see the things I need to tackle first by looking at this report right here. And report is completely customizable to allow you to look at things the way you want to. So you can find the largest problems, the violations, the code metrics. Code metrics are really important for your code, especially the cyclomatic complexity. which is very, very important for unit testing, and you definitely want to see that. It's not shown here, but it's definitely something you need to focus on. I think we've ended the slide portion right on time, and now we're going to answer some questions that you might have over the last 45 minutes. So I think Serge is going to take over and do the question part.
Thank you, David. Just as a quick reminder, if you want to ask the question, you can do so using the questions window, which is located in the bottom part of the GoToWebinar panel on the right of your screen. For Meeting Burner, you can use the chat window, or you can use the Ask a Question button. I will mention as well, if you have any feedback on this webinar, if you have ideas for future webinars, feel free to type those in the questions window as well, or email us. Before we get to the questions, one final announcement that David's .NET Coding Guidelines book and the Rock Your Code conference DVD winner will be selected randomly out of the live event attendees shortly after the webcast, and we will notify the winner per email. The first question is from David Corbin, and David is commented on your code sample, and David says, is closed does not need own state, use closed on, dot has value, prevents inconsistent behavior. I'm going to let David comment on that real quick.
Was that one just the naming of is closed or closed on? Can you say that one again?
He was suggesting instead of using is closed, to use closed on dot has value.
Yes, I'm not sure if it was a sample. I could go back to it. It's hard for me to go back to it right now, but yes, he's right. You could use has value. The thing I don't like about has value is especially for juniors, is it's just easier to wrap that up or encapsulate that in a property, and that's usually the way I prefer to do it. I understand what he's saying.
Virgil is asking, if an exception is thrown inside the using, is it still cleared up?
Yes. So the great thing about the using statement is it will catch, well, okay, so he's saying if it's released. Yes, it will be released. So what the using statement is really just a shortcut for developers. Before the using statement came out, which I think was in version .NET 2.0 or a little bit after that, the way we made sure that everything was cleaned up correctly is we just did try finally blocks. And I think that was part of the first the code example for that. And so what the using statement does is just, we don't have to do that anymore. If you use the using statement and then look at the IL compiled by C# or VB.NET or F#, all it does in the end is do a try finally block in the IL. So yes, the answer to his question is yes, definitely. It will always be cleaned up just like it was when we did it manually.
Another question is from Randy Stone, which standard would be best to start with for developers that are not used to a standard? And I think David will agree with me that Microsoft standard is the one to go with.
Yes, I do agree. The Microsoft design guidelines are definitely a good way to get started. There's lots of standards out there, like we talked about, the standard that you're all going to get free, my book. The thing with some of the other standards is kind of, if you look at the Microsoft design guidelines, it's really large. And if you have new developers new to standards, it's very, very overwhelming. I think it's better to start off, maybe especially with newer developers to standards, with some other standard out there, you know, like the submain one or my book that kind of shrinks it down to what you really need to pay attention to first. Do you agree?
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
Peter's story says that maintainability is not advanced. The checklist that we showed, the sample checklist, says maintainability is not advanced. It is a prime mover for everything else. I personally totally agree. The checklist was really a sample. The goal of the checklist was to give an idea how to start working with implementing coding standards within a team, and the starter list is the goal of that is just to start with the guidelines that are easier for the developer to start working with. If you have them focus on the really hardcore things, they'll get frustrated because it will be more difficult for them. So you always start with the easy stuff.
Oh, I agree. And that's one of the things, that list was definitely just a guideline. But of course, depending on your team or company, you need to switch some of those things over. I definitely would. One of my big things is design, and you need to have design early on. But it's really up to your team or the project you're working on to decide which is priority, which is a lower priority.
Right. Now we have a couple of questions about CodeIt.Right. First one from Michael Joseph. Is there any competitive upgrade pricing? Half of his team is using another product right now. So just there is email address on your screen right now. Feel free to send us email. And yes, we do offer competitive pricing. Send us email and we will provide you with details. Richard Hanhausen is asking if we offer a complimentary copy for a Microsoft MVPs. Yes, absolutely. And again, we'll send you a link to the page where you can fill out the form, and Microsoft MVPs do get complimentary copy of our product. And also, Virgil is asking how are team standards shared among team members. In the Enterprise Edition of the product, there is a feature that allows to publish, but essentially there is a team configuration module that allows to configure standards for the whole team and then publish it, push it onto the developer workstations. They essentially distribute it to the rest of the team. I'm pretty sure there are some more questions here. I need to scroll the list here real quick.
Well, I started scrolling the list.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
Another question is, how is CodeIt.Right different from StyleCope? I'll let David comment on that first, and then I'll add if necessary while I'm looking through a list of questions.
Sure. So there's actually a really big difference between StyleCope and CodeIt.Right. Or even analyze if you have the correct version of Visual Studio. StyleCope is actually an internal application that Microsoft's been using ever since .NET was being designed. I had early access to it, and StyleCope really focuses on the style, like its name, the style of the code. Like if your constructors are all in the same place, if your properties are in the same place, if code that's either how it's visible is in the correct places. It enforces things like XML commenting on top of your methods and classes. So it really focuses on more of the writing or stylistic parts of your code. And that's about it. What CodeIt.Right does is it fixes on, not only does it use those things too, but it also checks, just like Analyze does, it checks for performance issues, globalization issues, and all the many categories we've said during this session is really the maintainability, the performance, and things like that of your code, where StyleCope doesn't do that at all. And so now that StyleCope is public, it just makes it easier. Unfortunately, it's only in C#, but it makes it easier to have everything look consistent when you're doing code reviews and things like that.
Right. Thanks, David. So just to sum up real quick, StyleCope and CodeIt.Right, they work with source code. There's some subset of rules that are common, but StyleCope is, again, aimed at more of a formatting, styling, naming conventions, while CodeIt.Right is heavily addressing issues like performance, security, things that StyleCope does not even look into. StyleCope will only work with C# code. CodeIt.Right does both C# and VB. CodeIt.Right offers fix the code right there on the spot, and StyleCope only finds the issues. Also, one of the latest versions of CodeIt.Right, in fact, integrates with StyleCope, so you can run StyleCope using CodeIt.Right in the background, whether in the real-time code analysis or on demand or in your build integration. You can actually have CodeIt.Right run the StyleCope rules, and on top of that, CodeIt.Right actually will help you refactor those issues that StyleCope finds, which StyleCope doesn't offer, but CodeIt.Right extends it and comes with built-in refactorings for most of StyleCope rules. Another
I really
question,
like that new feature, by the way.
what is the difference between CodeIt.Right and code analysis tool for Visual Studio? On a high level, code analysis or FX scope, they work with binary code and not source code. First, they cannot refactor, not as much flexibility, but actually have about 10-page white paper on how CodeIt.Right is better than code analysis. You're welcome to send us email and we'll provide you with a copy of that PDF. It's a 10-page PDF. It is hard to really answer that question within 1 minute. One more question from Ravi. My style is to create many .cs files with a small method / classes. This results in a project with hundreds of CS files. Is that bad practice? I was told too many .cs files is bad design. What do you think, David?
Too many can be overwhelming, but I'd like to know more. And if you want to send an email, I'd be glad to chat with you about it. I'd like to know more, why you're creating so many small ones. But on top of that is, what is really the use of each class? And the class I refer to as type, and type should be very specific for what they do. If you're doing hundreds of types, I'd really like to look at exactly why that's going on. I don't want to say it's necessarily a bad practice. I'd like to know more about it so you can see it to make sure you're doing it right. It's kind of like the old days where people would come up to me and say, well, my application is slow, and I ask them, well, how many controls do you have on it? And they say hundreds, and I go, well, that's probably not a good idea. So I'd really have to dig into that a little bit more, and I'm more than willing to.
There was also a comment about, few comments actually, that would be good to show how CodeIt.Right the issues that CodeIt.Right finds and how it fixes them. We would love to show that, but for this webinar, we're actually trying to provide as much information about the process and about the approach, how to implement coding standards in the organization and succeed at that and not fail. If you are interested, again, send us email. We can do a live web demo if you want. We can provide really cool examples how CodeIt.Right refactors patterns like custom serialization, iDispose, iFinalize, and some interesting issues it finds and fixes. Give us a shout. We'll be happy to do demo, or we'll be happy to do webinar if more than a few people are interested to see that. A last minute question from Richard. Has anyone configured CodeIt.Right to run automatically with Elastic hosted Visual Studio Online builds? That is something that we're working on right now. And if you want to do a beta test, we will be happy to work with you, Richard. All right. I think that's all of the questions. I don't see any other questions waiting. I will mention again that we will be posting a link to the recording of this webcast. So everyone who is registered, we will have an email out to you within the next few days. Information is up on the screen. If you want more information on Submain, you can contact us. You can review the video. We will send you a recording and ebook. And at this, we will conclude today's webinar. And thank you, David, for presenting, and thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks. See you guys.